Welcome back everyone to another Technique Coding programming tutorial. In this video, I want to go over a couple things in Xcode for iOS that are usually used in production-ready apps, but aren't really talked about too much until you're on a team or you've seen it out in the wild, and that is build configurations and environment variables, both of which do really much the same thing, and that is to set flags and configure your project to run and for build processes as well. Let's just get right into it, I suppose. All right, so the first thing I want to do is I want to actually go over a little bit about these things because there are a couple differences, but also there's a lot of similarities between the two. Okay, so starting off, we've got our build configurations. Now, for the build configurations, you edit these within Xcode, and while you can still edit your environment variables within Xcode, you can only edit the build configurations from within Xcode. Now, you might be able to build a script to automatically do this and edit the Xcode files themselves, but generally speaking, that's kind of cumbersome and honestly not necessary because that's exactly what the environment variables will be used for, which I'll go over here in a second. So build configurations, they're found within Xcode. These also include all of your projects, other build settings and build configurations, things that include like setting what architecture should and should not be built, your app icons, your bundle identifiers, pretty much all of that is also included in your build configurations. The difference being is you can also add custom build settings to these as well. Now, usually when we're using these in a production setting, you will have them split up between production, staging, QA, and development. If you're unfamiliar with those terms, I highly recommend looking those up, but just as kind of a comprehensive overview, those different environments are used to build the app in such a way to test them on different possible run environments. So for instance, if I have a development build or a debug build as it's sometimes called, that's only really for developers to use on their local environments. You might have things set up where you have workarounds or like local development hacks to auto subscribe yourself as to a subscription to avoid having to pay for stuff every single time. For a QA environment, you might want to expose certain things to a QA tester that regular beta testers won't have to make their lives easier. The staging environment is generally used to completely mock and clone the live production environment as a last minute test to see if anything's going to break on a live setup before you push that to production. It's kind of like a last minute check, if you will. So those are all the build configurations and kind of what they're used for when it comes to, Xcode. Now, as far as the environment variables are found within the scheme settings of Xcode. And I'll go over this and I'll show you exactly where all of these things are in Xcode right after this. But environment variables are primarily found within the scheme settings. These are very flexible, so these should be used for values that change quite frequently. Also, they can be edited externally. So usually a good example of this is when you're using an automated build pipeline. So if you're not familiar with that, take a look at continuous integration and continuous delivery, which is CI/CD pipelines. And you'll get a better understanding of what I mean by those if you take a look. But as a general overview again, they're automated processes where you could submit your app and commit it to version control. And then these pipelines would have hooks that will recognize when you push to a certain branch in version control. And they will automatically build and distribute your app however you have it configured. That could be to automatically deploy this for QA testing. It could be automatically create a build that you can distribute amongst internal testers or internal stakeholders like product owners or the CEO of a company that just want to test these things out. But those configurations that will build based off these pipelines can be configured with environment variables that will adjust your Xcode build and flip flags or turn on or off different settings or capabilities in your app for those builds. So again, if you want a QA tester to have access to certain screens that the public won't have, you can use an environment variable to flip that on in these certain builds. Great uses of this, I already mentioned the development flags. You can turn on or off whether or not you can force a subscription state. Log levels, those are pretty heavily used. Things like how much data do you want shown in certain logs or to the user or through email, bug trackers, what have you, in different environments. As you might notice, there are pretty heavy overlaps between these two. Now, you can use both of these to do everything I just said, minus obviously, within the projects, within the build configurations, those have Xcode very specific things that you can't really adjust anywhere else. Except some of them, most of them actually, you can adjust and override with environment variables. So it's really up to the developer on what they want to use each one for and whether or not there's a need for one versus the other. It really is case by case. But the general rule of thumb is anything that's not going to change very often, add to the build configurations area. It's actually really nice and neat the way it's set up, and I'll show that here in a second. Anything that's going to change frequently or you have to have direct access to during the build cycle to specify in the build environment for these build tools, use an environment variable for. Now, you can use both at the same time, which makes things even more convoluted. I know. Bear with me. I like to call those like hybrid settings. So basically what you would do is you would have a build configuration, and then you would allow an environment variable to be set that would override the build configuration. And I will show you an example of this in the code as well. But generally speaking, build configurations, things that are long-standing that don't change very often. Environment variables, things that change very frequently, or things that you need to be able to set from the build pipelines. I'm going to come over to my desktop here, and I'm going to start a new app. And we're going to call this environments. We're going to say SwiftUI, language, storage none. Everything looks good. We're going to hit next. We're going to store it. And cool. So we have the basics of our app here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new file. It's going to be a SwiftUI view called build info view. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to give us a little bit more space to work here. It's going to be a really simple screen, so it shouldn't take us too long to actually build this out. But I'm going to move this up to give us a little bit more space. And then I am going to minimize the left-hand side, show the preview window again. And then we're going to do a list. Again, what we're trying to get to here is this screen. So I'm using a list. We don't really need a list, but I'm using it for styling purposes. We get a nice little style bump out of it that I don't have to do anything crazy here. And then we're going to say section. We're going to do header for the section, and right now we're going to do text, and we're going to say build config variables. Zoom in a little bit here so we can see a little bit better. Okay, so for the header, what we're going to do is we're going to say frame max width dot infinity. What this does is it forces this text to just span across horizontally. And we're going to say alignment is leading. Cool. A lot of this stuff is going to be just straight up basic SwiftUI. So if you don't know what's going on here, I'm not going to go over it in this video. Just take a look at it. If you have any questions, then you can just Google on your own time. We're going to say font. We're going to use a system font. The only thing we're doing here is we just want to specify the size. We're going to say font weight. Font weight semi-bold for it to stand out a little bit. And then we're just going to add some padding to it. This will generally only affect, this padding right here, will generally only affect the different sections we have in the app. Okay, so next thing we want to do is we want to make a row. So we're going to say vStack. We're going to give it hstack here. What we're doing now is we're recreating one of these rows with this little line here too. So we're going to say hstack text environment. We're going to say spacer to push the two texts we have here on opposite ends. Just for the sake of it right now, we're going to give this a value of debug. Then we're going to just style this a little bit. So we're going to say foreground style. I'm going to say it's black color with an opacity of 0.6 to fade out just a little bit. Make it look nice and neat there. Cool. So next thing we want to do is create that little line we've got at the bottom. So we're just going to say rectangle. We're going to say foreground style. And it's going to be black with an opacity of 0.6 again. And then we're going to say the frame. We're going to give it a size of 1 pixel height. And then that's it. That's all we need. Cool. All right, so we got the basics of that. So what we're going to do now is we're actually just going to pull these down. What I like to do is whenever I use a view that will only be used in a file, in one file, I usually just make an extension and then create new views that can be reused more easily in here. So this is going to be a header view. We say private extension build info view struct header view and then we're going to pull everything up here in the header down into the body. We're going to say var title string, and then obviously we need to tell the text element that it's going to be a title. Now we can switch this to header view. Cool. Now we can use that. We're going to do the same thing for this content right in here. That's for one row. And we're going to say, we're going to mark this. Again, if you're unfamiliar with these little markings, all this does is allows you to click on this little ribbon right here, and you can see the sections more easily. And you can even type in like header view so you filter out and quickly navigate between the different marked areas of the file. We're going to call this one info row, private extension, build info view. And then we're going to copy everything in this vStack right in here. And then we need two properties called title, value, and the title is going to go right here, and the value right here. Pretty straightforward stuff. Nothing, we're not reinventing the wheel here by any means. Cool. Now we have a mechanism to recreate everything here. So we're going to have one more option in here, and it's going to be called base URL. And we're just going to say for right now. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to create another section. So we got two more sections, just environment variables and hybrid variables. And it should be pretty easy just to throw in here. give some default values. And just for kicks, I'll just copy this one more time to give our last section called hybrid variables. And we're going to say log level. And we're going to give this, and we'll say info just for something a bit different. We're done. So that's the entire view. I mean, super simple, right? Like it's basic SwiftUI stuff, but the other thing we got to do now is we got to create a tab view, because we are gonna have one more view in this, and it's going to be conditionally shown based on the environment. So what we're going to do is, well, two things. First off, what I like to do in the previews, I just like to wrap this in a navigation stack just so I can see the navigation title we are about to give it. Let's minimize the list, and we will say cool. So we've got everything we need right there. Okay, so if we go into the content view right here, we are going to change everything inside here, and instead we're going to replace it with a tab view. Now let me scroll up here and move this a little bit so you can see this just a little bit better. All right, so tab view gives us the navigation at the very bottom that we see right here. In order to make this work, we're going to say navigation stack so we can see the titles for each of these views. And then we're going to say .tab item. It's going to have a label. It's going to be called build info. And the image we're going to use is ellipsis. I probably spelled it wrong. Oh, that's right. Okay. This is actually system image. There we go. We got a little icon right there now. Okay, cool. So then all we have to do is just make sure that the build info view is added and everything's right there. Cool. We're good to go. Okay, so now we get into the meat and potatoes of this thing. So in order to adjust your build configurations, what you need to do is you need to tap on your project name up in the top left-hand corner of the project. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this back down just a little bit here so we can see everything more easily. You're going to click on this, the project name, and then what you're going to do is go to your build settings. And the way you can tell that you already have some build configurations, look for anything that has this little drop down arrow, like build options, and it says debug or release. Every single Xcode project already starts with two build configurations. One's called debug and one's called release. So you're already doing this, and you can always switch back and forth between the two. To add more, you want to click on the project right here, go to info, and then you can hit this little plus icon right here, right underneath the configurations area. Now we can already see our two existing build configurations, but if we want to add a new one, just hit this little plus icon, and you can choose which one to duplicate from to create a new one. Generally speaking, I usually create new ones from debug because release has an optimization level on there that's different. But obviously it depends on your context. Do whatever you need to do when you're creating these things. Obviously each project's different. So I'm just going to create two new ones here. One of them is going to be called staging. And then another one is going to be called QA. If you're not familiar with these terms, debug is just local development for developers. QA are for builds that are sent to your QA team. And these might have some extra options in there, like you can show some debug options or might have some forced subscription states to make it easier on QA to test. Staging is just a copy clone of the release environment in order to test what it would be like in release. So they're like last minute checks to see whether or not there's going to be breaking changes that show up in the release build that you weren't expecting. And so you can fix it before you actually release it to the entire world. And then release is just the live version that everyone in the world who downloads it from the App Store uses. Generally speaking, these four, they make a little bit more sense if you're used to developing on the back end and you have actual servers for each one of these environments. Not always the case, but sometimes it can make more sense if you have previously been a backend developer. Cool, so we have our 4 build configurations, right? Now you're probably wondering, okay, well, how would I switch between these in the app? Like I already showed you that Xcode will show you in the dropdown the different build configurations for individual settings, and then you could adjust the settings individually from here. But in order to quickly change between the two, we're going to create more Xcode schemes. So right up here, we're going to manage these schemes and create one for each environment. Now, a real quick aside, sometimes you might see multiple targets to do the same thing. I personally don't do that. And the reason for that is unless you need a explicitly different info file for each target or for each environment, most of the things you can do are able to be adjusted just from the build settings. And I'm talking things like setting app icons, changing the bundle ID even. You can do straight from the build settings. So I've seen issues with using different targets to get cluttered for the same thing. Now, there are reasons you would use that. One thing is like sign-in capabilities. I think you might be able to actually have a sign-in capabilities file so you could actually use the build settings for this too. But generally speaking, there's niche use cases where, actually, you have them right here. So you can actually set different sign-in capabilities right from here. So I just fibbed. So there you go. One of the real use cases though for targets is if you have different extensions, such things like everything here, like action extension, background extensions, testing suites are a good example of that. But generally speaking, I find that build configurations are much cleaner to use rather than having to mess around with multiple targets and then deal with differences between the two. But in any case, let's go ahead and create some schemes here. So I'm going to go down to manage schemes. I'm going to rename this one. If I can, nope, go back, manage schemes. Click on it once, click on it again. There we go. Environments, production. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this and click duplicate. Oh, come here. Duplicate. And we're going to call this one debug. No. Click on this guy. Duplicate. Staging, and then we're going to have one more. No, shoot. All right, I'm clicking all over the place today. We have another one, and we're going to call this one QA. Okay, so we have all of our 4 environments. Now, in order for it to, oh, also, if you want to actually share this in your version control, you've got to make sure you click on this shared right here. This is what actually shares each of these schemes in version control. The nice thing about not sharing it though is if you want to create a scheme that only you have access to with your own custom environment variables, you can create one and not share it. It'll make more sense once we actually go over the environment variables in a minute. But the first thing I need to do is I need to actually set within each one of these environments what build configuration it uses. So now that I'm in the schema, I'm going to go over to info and I'm going to change the build configuration to release. And I'm going to go down each one of these on the left-hand side, and I'm going to switch it. Now, you can mix and match depending on your needs. Certain options here might be a different build configuration. Like usually when you're testing, it's not going to be the release because there's some optimizations in there. So you might want to keep this on debug. But for the sake of this video, I'm just going to have them all be the same right here. So then we're going to go to our debug scheme right here. We're going to say debug, debug, switch this to debug, and keep going down. We're going to go over to staging, do the same thing, just over and over again. And finally, I believe QA is the last one. QA, QA, and QA, QA, QA. Cool. Okay. So now that we switched those, we can more quickly just tap on the environment we want. And then just by building it after we've selected the schema, it's going to automatically switch to the environment that we chose. Okay, so how do we actually use this in the app? So let's show that. And the nice thing about the previews is we don't actually have to run the app right now. We can actually see the changes in the previews. But before that, what we need to do is we need to create our own user-defined build configuration setting. So so when we create one, we click on either the project or the target, and then we come up here to the top left right here, and we click on this little plus sign, user-defined setting. And then we can say, I usually call it app environment. And what you'll notice here is that if you have a setting that should be the same for every single environment, you can actually tap on the right hand side and just say something like, and just give them all the same value for this field. And then if you hit this toggle button down, you can see that it's going to commit to all of those environments. Now, because we're going to have it different on each of the environments, we're going to actually delete that. And then for each environment, we're going to say dev. We're going to say QA. This is going to be prod, just to make things easier. We're going to say staging. Make a mental note of how these are spelled, because we're going to need the actual value of these within the app. Now, because we added it here, we're about halfway to being able to use this in our app. Like the app's not going to know about this straight up just from putting it in the build settings. The other thing we have to do is we have to expose it to the app through the info area. Well, actually, it's on the target itself. But before I go over that, one thing I want to mention is if you create a user-defined build configuration setting on the project level, it's going to cascade down to all of your targets. So all of your targets will have access to it. If you want a build setting to be only on one specific target, you need to add it from the target after selecting it. The way you can tell whether or not a build configuration setting is defined in a certain area is the actual setting the text will be bolded. So right here, see how app environment is bolded? That means that we defined it on this currently selected area, which is the project level. If you go to the environment, scroll all the way down, you see how it changes from bold to normal. That's how we can tell whether or not it was defined here. The nice thing is, though, because this cascades down, you can override these things on an individual basis within the target. So we can say quality assurance, for instance. We can set that, and then it will bold this because it tells us that there's at least one value within this array that is custom to this target. Now, if we go back up to the project, you can see that nothing's changed on this level, but because we overrode something right here, it is overridden. So if we can actually delete that. Nope. There we go. Cool. Okay, so now what we need to do is I like to make one file. We need to be able to access this from within the project. To do that, we actually have to go to the info here and add a new key value pair. If I don't click off certain things here, and we're going to call this app environment. This little dash that I just added, the only reason I do that is because if I start typing, I'm going to get all of these auto corrections or suggestions, and for some reason, if I just keep typing, you see that it lowercased a couple of the characters here. So to avoid Xcode kind of messing with you, I just do a dash at first, do app, and then just go back and delete it. So this value, this key, is what you're going to use to access it from within the code. In order to link what's in the build settings to this value, we do a $sign with curly braces, and we say app environment. Now, the value here within this value area has to be the same as the key that we set within our build settings. This key right here is what we use to access it from the Swift code. So technically speaking, this does not have to be the same as what's in this value, but let's be consistent. So we've done that. Now, just because we're already on this subject, let's add one more. So our second one is going to be base URL, if I can't spell. And we're just going to give some dummy values here. We're going to say https dev.mysite.com. And then we'll just switch the domain. It's going to be QA. Or I should say subdomain. We're saying live for prod, and then we're going to do this and say staging. Cool, and then we've got one more, and this is going to be the hybrid one later on once we talk about the environment variables. We're going to say log level. And debug is going to be, well, debug. QA is going to be info. Release is going to be error. And then staging, we'll say info as well. Okay. Cool, so we got those. So we have to add the base URL and log level back to our info here. So we're going to go back here, create a new one. Make sure I name this correctly here. Base URL. Okay. Where to add that? Right here. So $sign curly braces. Okay. Then we got one more. And this one is our log level. Okay. So these are all added. Now, in order to actually add these to be able to access them from the Swift code, we're going to create a new object. And we're going to call this global settings. Say enum global settings. Also, like I said in previous, we're actually going to need UIKit here, I believe. No, we don't need that. Foundation. Like I mentioned in other videos, the reason you use an enum instead of a struct or class here, everything inside of here is going to be static. And the only reason I use an enum is to tell other developers that this should never be instantiated. You can switch it whenever you need, or you can change it to your needs. But I like to be explicit in this, even though we're not ever going to have any cases in this. I like to put it as an enum so someone doesn't come out and try to do the whole global, this whole thing, and thinking that they can do that. So it's a little nitpicky thing, but okay. So first thing we need to do is actually create a secondary enum called build environment. Now, remember what I told you about keeping a mental note on what the values of what are my build settings of this app environment were? Dev, QA, prod, staging, right? They have to coincide with this. Case dev cool. And of course, if you're not familiar with these, with a underlying value, the underlying string is going to take the same format as the actual case name itself. So this, leaving it just like that, would be equivalent of doing this, right? So we don't need that. We're going to use this to fetch the value from the build settings and then create and just return the actual build environment enum. So to do that, what we got to do is we have to say static let environment equals this. Okay, before I keep going, you can technically use a computed property like this, do it this way. This would be equivalent. The reason I don't do that is I like to keep these in memory. Either way is valid, and honestly speaking, this is just preference for me. The effect of the differences is just, it's so small that it's never going to affect anything. But this is generally just the way I do it. Guard let raw. Let's make some more space here so it's easier to see. I spelled that wrong. Cool. Okay, so what's going on here is we go to the info dictionary, which is this right here, and we're force unwrapping it because if it doesn't exist, we have more bigger issues because it should always exist for these projects. And then we are fetching a value of app environment, and we're casting it as a string. And then we are using the initializer for the build environment from the string to create the enum instance. And then we're just returning it. Now, a couple things to keep a note of here. You should really have tests. You can test this in a test suite. And that's probably the best way to do this. I'm not going to go over that in this video, but it's really useful to actually have a test suite that will test these things. So you don't have to worry about it if a developer comes in, changes a string up, say like, they're missing a T in the string or whatnot. We are forcefully failing this in an expected failure right here. That's why we have precondition failure, saying that we expect this to fail if this doesn't exist. And we want that to happen because the app really shouldn't be running if it doesn't have access to this. And obviously this can change depending on your needs. So maybe you'll have one that's in some environments, some that's not, or can't, what have you. But usually you want these things to exist. So now what we can do is we can copy this and go 2 more times. And I accidentally tapped the build button, so you can ignore that. Okay, so we need the base API path, which is going to be a string. And now we're going to say base URL, adjust this a little bit here. And actually, this is going to be around the same too, so we're just going to change that. And this is going to be our log level build config setting. Technically speaking, this might be a good candidate for an enum as well, but we'll save that for later. Cool. So now we have our settings here. So if we go into the build info view, now we can actually add these to our view. So for the environment, we can change this to global settings dot environment dot raw value, and I'm just going to capitalize it. Then for our base URL, global settings dot base API path, and then we have a log level down here. No, log level down here. Okay, the nice thing about previews too is that they will automatically change based on our state or our schema. So you can see that right now we're in the staging schema. So every single value in here, minus the environment variable that we haven't set up yet, is set to what we have for our staging. If I switch this to debug, this is going to reload and it's going to change just like we expect it to. This is going to be the exact same thing if I actually ran this. So if I go to QA, it's going to do the same thing. Switch to QA, all of our values there. Now I can run this in production, but I can't actually choose production for viewing the app in the previews. And that has everything to do with the optimization level. If I click on that, you're going to get an error that says you can't build for this optimization level. That's fine. We don't really need it to prove this point. Let's go back to debug, and we're going to switch all those things out. Cool. That's it. That's how you use build configurations. So then from here on out, if you have something that changes or you want to add a new configuration or setting, you can add them all right here. And it's nice because you can just toggle them right here, and you can avoid any unnecessary conditional logic to switch between these, because Xcode's doing that for you in the build, which is nice. Okay, so the next thing we have to do too is the second way of setting variables in your project, and that is environment variables. In Xcode are set within the schema itself. So if we're in debug, if we go to edit schema, come to run, rather, go to arguments, they're right here, environment variables. They can be anything you want, just like the build configurations. So we're going to add one, and we're going to call it log level. Actually, before I do that, we're going to say force subscribe. I'll go over hybrid variables here in a minute. And we're going to say true. These are always strings. So when you check these values from within Xcode, you have to check them against strings. Okay, so we have for subscribe. We're going to close that. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our global settings. We're going to minimize this area. We're going to mark this, say build. And we're going to come down here and do an extension. We're going to mark this as. Okay, so the way you access these is a little bit different because you're actually getting the process info rather than the info dictionary values. So we're going to say static, and just for sake of some variation, I'm going to actually do this into a computed property, force subscribed state bool. We say like key equals and double check to make sure I'm using the same for subscribe. these keys have to match with what's actually with what the environment variable actually is. We're going to say guard process info dot process info environment dot contains. We're going to say key equals key, else return false. Okay, and we're going to say return all of this stuff key. Now, the reason we're, hold on, equals true. So this is where we have to compare it against the string. So true or false, but this can be pretty much anything you need. Let's see. So you might be wondering why I'm returning a default value and I'm checking whether or not this key exists. So environment variables can be toggled on or off depending on things. You should develop in such a way that you can expect the environment variables to possibly not be present, which is what happens if I click this off. If I click this on, it's available. If I click this off, it's not going to be included in the build, and it's not going to show within this environment dictionary. So you want to make sure you solve for the use case where it doesn't exist at all. Cool. That's it. That's all we got. We have access to this environment variable. Now what we can do, and it's still off, but before I turn it on, I'm going to go over to my build info area, and I'm going to do global settings dot force subscribe state. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this. Cool. So it's off right now. So it's going to default to false right here, like we saw. And what I can do is I can actually do this so we can see a little bit more easily. If I turn it on, click on that, it's going to rebuild, and then it should turn to true. True. There you go. That's all you have to do for environment variables. Now, again, these are really, really useful as well, because say you want to just do some temporary environment variables to test your own functionality on your own Git branch. You can duplicate this, and we'll just leave it as copy. And we're not going to share it. I can go into that, go to arguments, and then create all my own environment variables and set them within the project just to toggle certain things here or there if I want to. So they can be very, very useful. Now I'm going to delete that again just so we're all on the same page. We're going to go back to our debug. Cool. So there you have it. That's build configurations and environment variables. The last thing I want to show you is this hybrid variable stuff. So right now, our log level is technically within the hybrid variables. What I mean by hybrid variables is you can have a build configuration that can then be overridden by an environment variable. So it's kind of like the best of both worlds. If you expect a value to not really change that often, but you might need to adjust it within a CI/CD pipeline or a build pipeline, this is the best of both worlds. And you can have a environment variable just override it. Generally speaking, it's actually not that hard to do. So if you go back into debug, edit scheme, I'm going to add another environment variable called log level. And we're going to give this one warning because I haven't used warning in any other area. So this is going to be a nice test to see if it shows up. I'm going to hit close. Did I turn that one on? It is on. Okay. So we're going to go back to our global settings. Now we're going to mark another area. Global settings. One thing that's important with these though, all of the old ways of fetching these should be private. we don't want a developer to accidentally use these in other areas of the app, because we want a one localized spot that has the default fallback to be used. So we want to make sure that no one's using the methods to fetch individual values from the build settings or environment variables. We want one method that uses both. So down here, we're just going to copy this. Down here, we're going to say log level. And then we don't need to, this isn't a Boolean, so we're actually going to do this, and we're going to return nil if it doesn't exist. So we're returning the actual string value if it exists. If not, we're returning nil. For subscribe state, this should be log level environment variable. And then we're going to say static var log level string. And all we're going to do is we're going to say log level environment variable and then fall back to the log level build configure setting. And I did not make this private. There. So now if we go back into our build info area and we switch this to our new log level, it's that warning. So now what happens is if I have this value and I turn this off, it's going to default to whatever's in the build configuration, which is debug. Let's go back and check it just to make sure. Log level debug is debug. And when we turn it back on, log level, close, it's going to rebuild and it's going to be warning. So that's it. So there's a lot of value into using this. These things are really useful when it comes to switching out different types of settings and configurations within the app. On that note, let me show you how to actually use this. So, and it's a really cool method. It's a replacement for preprocessor methods that you might be used to seeing. So if I come back in here, I'm going to create a new view and we're going to call this debug view. And I'm just going to copy and paste this in here because I don't want to spend too much time doing this because the point isn't the screen itself. The point is getting to the screen. But basically all this is doing is I've got two options here and each one of them will just show an alert. If I go into the live previews here, each one of them just shows an alert and that's it. Now if I come back to my content view, I'm going to create a new tab conditionally based on the environment. So we're going to say if, this is going to look a little weird at first, but bear with me. Go here so we can scroll down and see this a little bit easier. Okay, so if we scroll down, what this is doing is it's saying, if we say dev, see how this shows up? Okay, so this is an alternative to doing this. So this is a preprocessor method. If you've never seen this before, what's going to happen is that any code in here if we are under a environment that is labeled debug, it's going to compile this code. Else, it's going to compile this code. And Xcode will tell you, see how this is faded out a little bit? I don't know if you can see that. Let me try to zoom in here and it's not working. So anyway, See how this text is faded out a little bit? Xcode tells us that we're in this environment, so it's going to compile this. It's not going to compile this. So they're very useful. They can be kind of ugly, as you can see, and if seeing these everywhere just drives you nuts. Sometimes the formatting, so a lot of people will want to do this to maybe look it nice and neat. Xcode goes nuts when it comes to that. It doesn't allow you to do that if that's the way you want to format it. There might be a setting, but I just avoid it. It's up to you. There's nothing wrong with doing it this way. There are some benefits in compile size when doing it this way. If you have large bits of code that should be compiled in one environment versus another. Generally speaking, the footprint savings you get from this is not too much on an average app, but it's still valid. What I like to do though, and I think what works a lot better, is this. So now that I have my environment set up, this says if the current environment is within this array, run this code. So I can just say, okay, the development environment dot QA environment dot staging, all these environments in here, if the project is built with one of these environments active, it's going to show this option. So for instance, what I usually do is every single app I build has a debug options view right here. Now, if you go into that view, it's going to show a little, let's see here. Let me run this real quick. It's going to be easier to show you that way rather than in a preview. And it's going to take a few minutes to load here because these simulators love to be slow. Well, once it's up and running, we'll bring it back in. But in any case, in every app I have a debug options view. When you're in the debug options area, you can do pretty much whatever you want. The nice thing about having this kind of an area is that you can add, if you have a new flow that has multiple screens, or it's got some research and development type screens that not quite ready for production, also not quite ready to even be seen by anybody else, you can stick them in the debugs menu area, and then you don't have to worry about it sneaking out into the wild if it happens to actually make it into a production build. Okay, so finally built here. So if you look at the debug options area, like I said before, it's a great area to stick things that shouldn't make it into production. You can put pretty much anything in here. You can expose data from your database right here. A good example is sometimes people have certain criteria that need to be met in order to show the review dialog. Things like, has the user entered this screen a certain number of times? Has they done this? You can list that information from the debug options area, and test whether or not that criteria was hit to see that screen. Very useful for QA developers, by the way. But in any case, you don't want this to show if you're in any other environment than dev or QA. So to do that, we can just wrap this in this array and just say, hey, if we're in these two environments, show this. The other thing that's really useful, and I think is actually better than those preprocessor methods, you can create predefined environment arrays. So, something like let QA environments, or I don't know, debug view at environments equals build environment equals dev.qa, and then you can just pass this around. So instead of that, it would be debug view envs. Obviously, you could probably wrap this in a better object and do this more intelligently than what I'm doing here, but you have those options. So this is one way of actually using that environment and these build settings. The last thing I want to go over, and then promise this will be the end of the video, is that you can actually set your app icons with this as well. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go in and add some icons real quick. Here, app icon, we're going to do another one. Okay, so staging, we have this, QA, we're gonna give this. One thing you're gonna notice if you're a developer who's been working on a longer project is that Apple has changed Xcode where all you have to do is add a 1024 by 1024 image for the app icon and it will automatically parse it out and for every single platform. They should have done it 10 years ago, but it's nice to have it in there now. So as you notice, the only thing that's different in these app icons, I actually have staging, QA, and develop right in the app icon. This is very useful if you want to be able to discern the different builds in test flight. Because test flight doesn't necessarily change the display name, you can change it if you really want to, but it's much easier to have an app icon that has a difference depending on the environment than it is to have differences in app names and all that stuff. It's one of the clearest indicators that something's different. This is a very useful way to do this. So if we come back to our main area here, go to the target, general, come down to app icon, hit this little plus icon. We can change these on an individual environment basis. So app icon, I think I named it dev, right? Let's see, we'll have to check that here in a second, QA. And then this is just staging. And let me double check that. I did name it dev, okay. It's gonna change the app icon based on that. So if I rerun this, I'm in the debug or dev. So right now we don't have an app icon, but if I rerun this, and go back home, you can see, try to blow this up a little bit. You can see right here that the app icon actually changed. Now if I go back and I switch it to staging, hit run again, I go back home, you can see that this actually changed to staging. Super, super useful when it comes to test flight and giving people builds because they don't have to enter the app to actually see what build they're on. The last thing I wanted to mention is that you can do the same thing with the app display name right here. Click on this little plus icon and you can change this to env dev, env QA, hit enter. Then we're gonna run this app one more time, and you'll see that the app display name changed as well right here. And then of course, if you go back into your build settings and you look up name, you'll notice that Xcode actually adds those settings right here, so you can change it from within the build settings as well. Same thing with the app icon right down here. And that's it. Those are everything. So I'm hoping this gave you a better understanding of how to configure the app. These are heavily used in enterprise level apps, especially the ones that use a build process like Bitrise or Xcode Cloud. So if you wanted to know what a production ready app looks like, this is one step closer to that. There are a couple other things too, such as you can store API keys, such as like a Sentry key or anything else within the build configurations and environment variables. There are some risks to doing that, mostly due to security. It's up to the developer to really understand when and when not to use that. But as a general rule of thumb, if there's very, very little risk as far as like if someone does hack and steal those values, if it doesn't really matter to you, or if it's such a low risk that you're like, look, it's such a low risk, I'm going to take the chance. It's not worth my effort to go through all the security loops just to secure this one thing. I'm just going to add it to the build configurations. That's up to the individual developer. Usually people say that to be as secure as you can be, store that on the back end and then let the back end API of your own server proxy the requests to these third-party platforms. But that's up to you. I'm not going to tell you what to do and what not to do because every project is unique. But I hope this helped you out. I hope it gave you a better idea of how you can configure an app and certain things that are actually used in production-ready enterprise-level apps. But yeah, so if you liked the video, hit the like button down below. It's going to help me out a lot. I want to keep making these videos. So the more people who subscribe and actually watch, the more videos I'm going to start making. And definitely subscribe. But yeah, let me know in the comments below if you want me to expand on anything or if you want to see anything new or different. In the meantime, happy coding.